So my talk's entitled Cultural Transmission, Network Architecture, and the Evolution of Human Self-Awareness. And I'll just start off from the part that's kind of like the preamble, because we've already gone over the insights, just to save time a bit. So Rubinoff's insights on science and evolution and the importance of the history of science contain three main arguments. Firstly, that science provides a convention by which intersubjective truth claims can be evaluated and continually refined. Secondly, to accept science is to accept the canon of scientific knowledge and what it tells us about about evolution and how we came to be humans. And thirdly, that science evolved as a response to the conflicting ideologies that developed along with human civilization, from tribes to nations, ideologies that propose mutually exclusive explanations of human origins, often claiming the right of ascendancy over other groups. A final motivating quote, which I will return to several times throughout the talk, is that, quite elegantly, evolution is constantly evolving rigorously validated evidence of itself. This paper will situate Rubinoff's insights within an evolutionary approach to understanding culture, exploring how differences between social structures that transmit science, religion, and art affect their evolution. So I'll start off from the very beginning. Life on Earth has progressed from very simple beginnings to a bewilderingly complex and interconnected system in a little over 3.5 billion years. Relatively simple chemical compounds that were able to catalyze reactions and create copies of themselves tended to persist and multiply. Eventually, early molecular evolution yielded the chemical ancestors of RNA and DNA and the beginning of the genetic code. At its essence, the evolutionary process arising through genetic transmission that has generated the vast diversity of life on Earth has remained unchanged from these early beginnings. The emergence of novel forms and innovations, however, has vastly changed the ways in which the organisms themselves interact and shape the ecological landscape upon which evolution unfolds. From the first membranes that enclosed interacting molecular species to the social systems and division of labor of the ants and bees, biological innovations have resulted in an incredible array of novel ecological interactions whose emergent characteristics feed back and affect the course of evolution. Perhaps the most remarkable innovation in the history of life on Earth is the emergence of consciousness and the capacity for self-awareness. While there seems to be evidence for some level of consciousness in several animal species, none but Homo sapiens appears to have progressed to a point where it can apprehend the very nature of the processes that brought about its own existence. Human beings have evolved a diverse range of cultural ideologies that seek to answer the question, how do we come to be? Answers to this question have been numerous and diverse, and in a somewhat ironic turn, the conflicts generated in part by their disagreements have generated another novelty which is apparently unique to humans, the capacity for self-annihilation. Technologies that evolved along with culture have now reached a point where humans have amassed an arsenal of weaponry, such as nuclear weapons, powerful enough to bring about our own extinction. It is, of course, a gross oversimplification of history to ascribe all violent conflicts to ideological disagreement, but the contribution of this aspect of human culture is pervasive. A major theme of evolution on Earth, however, has been its reactive nature. As genetic evolution is based on random mutations sorted by natural selection, solutions closer to some environmentally defined optimum are only achieved through a gradual groping, often with missteps and deleterious side effects. Many evolutionary novelties have radically changed the course of evolution in a way that could never have been predicted before the fact, such as the invasion of a prokaryote by the ancestor of mitochondria, eventually yielding a symbiotic body plan that enabled the radiation of all subsequent eukaryotic lineages. With the advent of consciousness, however, life on Earth has developed the capacity for foresight. Imagination, experimentation, and learning allow conscious organisms to adapt to their environments within their own lifespan. Without cultural transmission of the information accrued within the lifespan of an organism, however, this learning is lost at death and long-term evolution is unaffected. Cultural transmission imbues evolution with predictive power by enabling imaginative and directed responses to problems of existence to be passed down through time. The aim of this talk is to discuss how the emergence of human consciousness and culture has resulted in new evolutionary modalities, yielding a capacity for self-awareness and foresight. I will compare and contrast three different cultural approaches to providing answers about human origins: science, religion, and art. I will work under the assumption that the ideas developed and communicated by each of these approaches are themselves evolving entities, and will focus on how differences in the social systems and philosophies underlying these approaches affect the very evolution of the ideas they seek to communicate. Specifically, how they have addressed the questions, how do we come to be? So, just coming back to this original quote, Rubinoff's discussions about the importance of science at the end of the age of agriculture this quote about quite elegantly, evolution is constantly evolving, rigorously validated evidence of itself. We'll talking, kind of contextualizing that within what we know about how evolution works. So the aim of this talk is to situate religious, scientific, and artistic approaches within an evolutionary framework. And that really the science of evolution is all about explaining patterns of diversity. And so I'm going to take this kind of approach to this. At the end of the age of agriculture, the diversity of opinion and religious differences that have contributed to political instability and the potential for nuclear war require explanation. We need to understand how they came to be, and perhaps by understanding how such diversity of opinion has evolved, we can find the means to reconcile some of the differences that have generated this kind of conflict. So just to start off, I'll just start by comparing genetic and cultural evolution, just to look at the differences between them. So the process and dynamics of cultural evolution differ from those of genetic evolution in two really important ways. The architecture through which the variants are transmitted, and the manner by which novel variation is generated. And so I'll start off by discussing the second of these, the generation of novelty. Biological evolution is based on genes, which can be easily defined and measured. While culture doesn't have a unit of inheritance that is easily measured, like a gene, it's clear that information can be passed from one individual to another through a variety of different media. And for this talk, I'm just going to follow Richard Dawkins in the way that he's described culture as using the term meme to define a unit of culture. But I'm going to stay kind of abstract and not get into the problems of what actually a meme is and what actually a genetic variant is. I'll just say it's a unit of information that can be passed from one individual to another and that can carry some kind of cultural information. So the simplest way that culture can evolve is through copying error from one generation to the next, which is effectively quite similar to genetic evolution through random mutation. An example of this is birdsong and Darwin's finches, which learn their songs from their parents, but which can sometimes copy imperfectly or copy the songs of nearby individuals or other species. Because some cultural traits are learned and can perform a function, they can also be elaborated within the lifespan of an individual through experimentation and refinement. In this case, novelty is either generated through random variations in the execution of behavior, just by trying things differently, but not actually with any directed focus, or through an actual imaginative process where the problem is conceived and a solution is devised, and there's an actual thing. And I've just put down here, these result in very different speeds of evolution progressing. So the occurrence of learning within the lifespan of an individual effectively constitutes a nesting of evolutionary process, as learning is akin to natural selection in the way that it sorts between potential solutions according to their suitability for a given problem. Thus, memes can be seen as being selected both within an individual or within a population, whereas genes experience selection only at the population level. And this results in evolution in culture progressing much more quickly than evolution in genes, or has the potential to. Memes can be favored within an individual because they result in behaviors that yield enjoyable physical stimuli, because they represent ideas that are in harmony with other memes favored by the individual, it's like a toast miracle, because they represent ideas or behaviors that promote identification with a social group, because they aid in performing some kind of task that's related to the problems of existence, either biological or social existence. Perhaps because they provide some more complete or logically consistent explanation of a phenomenon, like the Copernican theory of cosmology. And then finally, the decision to publicly communicate a meme also affects its net fitness and the rate at which it increases or decreases in frequency and spreads through a population. So Richard Dawkins proposed that some memes, such as evangelist religious teachings that induce an individual to actively work to transmit them, often at considerable cost to their fitness, like celibate monks, these kind of things can effectively function as viruses of the mind, and so this type of thing also affects the rate at which memes are transmitted. While a case can be made for the indirect benefits of reproductive success from some of these drivers, like maybe inclusive social fitness, only two of these are really directly, are selected upon directly for their truth value or for their functionality. So here I've just kind of circled the fire-making and cosmological principle, because these are examples of the kinds of cultural variants that actually experience selection directly for utility. So fire-making is directly useful, and cosmological principle is something that's actually been shown to be have real explanatory power, whereas everything else, there's a lot of reasons why a culture can also spread that have really nothing to do with how useful or how beneficial it is. So just to talk now a bit about transmission dynamics, truly de novo ideas that arise without any cultural precursors are likely very rare. While Newton developed a system of mathematics and physics that revolutionized the way humans understood their relation to the world, he famously acknowledged that he was standing on the shoulders of giants. Since much cultural novelty consists of elaborating upon, combining, and refining existing memes, the dynamics through which memes are transmitted have a critical influence on evolutionary outcomes. Before the advent of written communication, inheritance of ideas was constrained by the ecology of the communicators. If two people could not interact in physical space, then they would never exchange ideas. Successive technological developments, themselves the product of cultural evolution, have enabled communication spanning both time and space, transcending the physical limitations of purely verbal modes of cultural inheritance. Memes have been sent between the Earth and the Moon and out into deep space, and have been recovered from the texts of ancient civilizations. Even so, the communication is still constrained by the architecture of the communication networks created by the technology. To return to the comparison with genetic evolution, beneficial genetic mutations will typically spread through a population with a probability relative to their effect on fitness. So if they're very beneficial, they'll spread easily. If they're not very beneficial, they won't spread easily. Very intuitive. If a mutation increases the reproductive output of an organism by 1%, it will only have a 2% chance of actually spreading through the entire population, as it can still be lost due to random events. This limit derives from the vertical nature of genetic transmission and the constraint that genes can only be passed from parents to offspring. Now, because memes can spread from one individual to many through mass communication, the probabilities of them spreading are very different. So Lieberman and colleagues recently, there's an interesting paper on spread of memes, have shown that certain communication architectures that feature a few highly connected central nodes and lots of outlying nodes, like this star topology here that I've shown. These kind of communication architectures basically guarantee the spread of a beneficial mutant. There's effectively, if there's a new mutation that arises, I can't really point to it here, but in that very central area there's nearly a 100% chance that it will spread to the entire population, which is very different from a genetic mutation. So the architecture of the actual transmission network greatly affects the way that memes are spreading through the population. This type of one-to-many network architecture is common in the internet, television, and other modern technological networks. By contrast, in more traditional social networks, where all individuals have approximately the same connectivity, memes will tend to spread much more slowly in a fashion similar to the spread of genetic mutants. Because memes can be combined to form new memes with completely novel characteristics, exposure to variation mediated by the architecture of the transmission network can greatly affect the rate at which evolution progresses. While these one-to-many networks favor the spread of evolutionarily beneficial memes, this does not necessarily mean that it is the memes themselves that have any inherent truth value, or that they're actually beneficial to the individual. As I described before, memes can spread for any number of reasons, many of which are completely unrelated to the truth value or the effects on an individual's biological fitness. When I say beneficial, all I mean is that it's spreading for some reasons, and it could be favored for having no relation to truth value or to its effect on the individual's fitness. For example, memes concerned with explaining why the sky is blue or how the universe came to exist can spread with little correlation to an individual fitness or truth value. The diversity and popularity of the world's religions is testament to the decoupling of the fitness of a meme from its truth value, as many religions offer mutually exclusive answers to these questions. And they cannot all be true, but all of them must have had high fitness if they've gotten to where they are today. Because these kinds of networks favor the spread of any evolutionarily beneficial mutation, they can favor the spread of memes that have little truth value or little benefit to the individual. If communication is unidirectional, so if you're imagining it flowing outwards from that central dot in the very middle, flowing out from highly connected nodes without cycling back, the evolutionary dynamics may depend even more strongly upon the architecture, effectively limiting the potential for a novel meme arising in a minimally connected node to spread to other minimally connected nodes. So if a beneficial mutation arose where the arrow's originating and wanted to spread, or it would never reach the other individual there that it's pointing to. That just can't happen by this kind of transmission network. So I'm just trying to illustrate the ways that transmission networks really affect the evolution of memes, but how it's different with genes. When memes offer competitive and mutually exclusive explanations of real-world events or phenomena, the influences of transmission architecture may sometimes drive dynamics more strongly than selection at the individual level, especially when communication is mediated by networks with one-to-many unidirectional architecture. Furthermore, when individuals are not presented with an alternative explanation from competing memes, even memes with very inaccurate information can spread through populations connected by one-to-many networks. By contrast, when memes do not compete, one-to-many transmission networks will simply increase the rate at which a meme spreads without compromising the spread of other memes. It is therefore clear that the transmission network can greatly impact the spread of, or the rate of cultural evolution. So I'm going to step back from these kind of process-oriented questions now to look more at science, religion, and art. And kind of how they address these questions of how do we come to be. So again, returning to this quote, perhaps one of the most poetic results of the process of evolution is the emergence of cultural narratives attempting to explain their very origin and genesis. So again, quite elegantly, evolution is constantly evolving rigorously validated evidence of itself, and this is seen in science in the way that science is understanding its own origins. Approaches to answering the question, how do we come to be, can be coarsely divided into three categories, and over the final section of the essay, I'm going to try and compare and contrast the modes by which these three types of culture have evolved. And I'm going to put specific focus on the differences in the types of memes that they use and in the transmission networks through which they're communicated. And so the whole preamble about how these transmission networks affect the evolution, I'm going to try and put that into context of how these different types of culture differ in the ways that they have in the types of transmission networks they use. And as Marshall McLuhan famously stated, the medium is the message. And in the present context, the medium may be seen as the technology or the social network that mediates the transmission of the evolving ideas. And this informs the way that we understand how it affects the evolution of the ideas themselves. Religious explanations of human origins have deep roots, drawing their original inspiration from some form of individual human experience. All religions survive through some form of transmission from the individuals who formulated the original narratives through to those in the present day who take on the responsibility of ensuring their continued transmission. Whether religion is transmitted orally or through written texts, the major religions of the world have in common a respect for the tradition and for the accuracy of the teachings inherited from the past. Knowledge derived from individual human experience is typically interpreted relative to the perceived absolute truth value of this received religious knowledge, and will rarely modify the information content of the religious memes transmitted from one generation to the next. Even in cases where religious knowledge and explanation is seen as providing metaphorical rather than absolute truth, the religious memes are still typically transmitted without alteration or revision in light of subjective experiences. Radical challenges to received wisdom have sometimes resulted in the founding of new religions in light of the perceived need for revision, such as by Christ or Muhammad. But in any case, the revision of religious narratives in light of experience is the exception rather than the rule. Religious communication networks are typically tailored to preserve the integrity of the information they transmit. From the Amazonian shaman to the Catholic priest, religions typically have converged upon very similar structures for their transmission, usually involving the maintenance of the traditions by passing them between appointed individuals from one generation to the next, coupled with the dissemination of traditions through the general public by some form of one-to-many transmission. And so the figure I'm showing here is just each step on this rung is kind of like imagining a generation of priests or something like this. From early churches and gathering houses to modern superchurches and continent-wide communication of sermons via satellite television, one-to-many unidirectional transmission from the priest class to the public has effectively minimized the potential for revision and modification of received traditions. Furthermore, the priest class typically follows a range of social conventions and hierarchical organizational structures, ensuring the faithful reproduction and transmission of inherited traditions from one generation of priest to the next. This very architecture may be seen as a natural evolutionary consequence of the worldview espoused by most religions, namely that by prioritizing the truth value of inherited traditions, those religions that find ways to ensure their faithful reproduction tend to be the most successful. It is also important to note that when new religions are founded from old ones, it is typically due to some difference in interpretation of received doctrine. Subsequent competition between these daughter religions may favor those that are most vocal or able to evangelize, as religious doctrine typically contains no formal mechanism to evaluate the relative truth value of competing explanations. A form of natural selection thus operates at the level of competing religions, where the fitness of competing religions is not at all connected to their truth value, but their ability to be loud and vocal. The emergence of the scientific method represents a radical departure from this type of cultural approach to explaining human origins. Where religion prioritizes the truth value derived through inherited traditions, science emphasizes the truth derived from experience and intersubjective agreement about the interpretation of this experience. While scientific knowledge is passed from one generation of researcher to the next, and disseminated to the public through the education system, and thus closely resembles the priest-congregation organization, revision of the knowledge passed through this network is open to any individual presenting appropriately codified explanations of the reasons for challenging previously existing explanations, whether they are formally recognized as a researcher or a part of the general public. Indeed, some of the most substantial scientific revolutions, such as Einstein's theory of relativity, have been formulated outside of the academic system, most formally charged with the transmission of the scientific canon. Highly connected nodes can thus originate anywhere in the network, as opposed to the rigorous vertical transmission of typical religious architectures. While the ideas of both science and religion are dogmatic, science is formulated around a mechanism for the comparison, evaluation, and selection among competing mutually exclusive explanations. Religious networks are characterized by few-to-many architecture with unidirectional meme flow and vertical inheritance between the highly connected nodes from one generation to the next. By contrast, the scientific networks are also characterized by few-to-many architecture. They tend to allow reticulated meme flow back to the central nodes, and this results in the type of architecture that's much more fluid, but which still provides a mechanism for rapid dissemination and revision of the memes. If we assert that there is some objective truth, regardless of whether it can ever be perceived by human consciousness, science approaches this truth through a process that is evolutionary in its very nature. The process of generating a range of explanations and then selecting those which are most concordant with human experience and observation is at its essence an evolutionary process. In contrast, by codifying the experience of a single individual or group of individuals and transmitting this information faithfully, the religious approach effectively constitutes an attempt to counteract the very processes that give rise to variation and natural selection. Fundamentally, the process involved in the transmission of religions represent an attempt to resist the changes involved in evolution, as the very architecture of the communication network prioritizes traditionally inherited memes over those derived from experience. The religious devotee thus places faith in the accuracy of the original insight of its founder and in the replication accuracy of all subsequent transmission events. While transmission through written communication may be relatively error-free, most religions undergo a period of oral transmission before being codified, which may be considerably more error-prone. Furthermore, as was the case with early Christianity, many religions are only codified following the competition of varying interpretations of the original inspiration of the founder, such as the Gnostic Gospels versus the Catholic interpretation in Christianity. As I've described before, selection between competing splinter religions may be driven more strongly by economic power and the capacity for transmission than by any inherent truth value. And you can see this with, say, the spread of the Mormons in present day. Since religions do not typically contain any formal mechanism for evaluating the relative truth values and comparing them. By comparison, the scientific devotee places faith in explanations that have satisfied the criteria for empirical testing and intersubjective agreement. And even then, faith is based on probability and likelihood, rather than a belief in absolute truth. As all scientific knowledge is subject to the evolutionary process and natural selection according to the concordance between a given explanation and empirical observations, the scientific devotee places faith in a process rather than any specific explanation. A product of the constraints of the scientific method, however, is that its adherents must satisfy themselves with an incomplete understanding of the universe, as uncertainty is inherent in the process and approach to satisfactory answers is necessarily slow. It is here that art can provide a complement to the empirically based scientific exploration of the question of human origins. If science represents humanity's attempts to become aware of the collective memory of life itself, as described by Rubinoff, then art is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is a proof of a journey, and as the artist navigates the unknown, art adds to the collective memory. While art is perhaps the oldest form of human cultural expression for which we have concrete evidence, it has changed more rapidly and generated more diversity than either science or religion. Unlike science and religion, art does not typically attempt to provide dogmatic explanations of objective truth. Rather, art provides a medium for the communication of individual perceptions and is intensely rooted in the subjective experience, both in its creation and its interpretation. Furthermore, while art is typically distributed from one artist to many individual observers, the structure of transmission networks that diffuse artistic creations is very fluid and constantly changing as new artists emerge and older artists cease to create. This architecture contrasts strongly with religious transmission networks, as the one-to-many architecture allows the rapid spread of memes, but its fluidity does not prioritize the transmission of any single group or social class over long periods of time. As such, art tends to evolve rapidly. While transmission networks have undoubtedly influenced the spread of certain and codification of certain styles, such as expressionism or surrealism, and the subsequent responses to these styles, the transmission network doesn't constrain the evolution of art in the same way that could be said of science or religion, because artistic memes are not dogmatic and they're non-competitive. And what I mean by this is that you wouldn't really say that Dali's melting clock conflicts in some serious way with Warhol's can of soup. They're talking about different things, or they're mutually compatible. The emergence of scientific explanations of human origins has effectively challenged the dogmatism of early religious explanations, throwing their universalism into question. Science, however, is based on empirical observation and logical axioms. As many of the questions surrounding the existence of the universe and the nature of human consciousness lie beyond the reach of the scientific method, the replacement of religious explanations with scientific ones has left a void where science can make no comment. It is here that art has evolved and flourished, providing a complement to scientific understanding. Art can provide an entry point and means to reflect upon and enrich the understanding of any given subject material. When it reflects upon the discoveries of science, as seen by the art of Jeffrey Rubinoff, Juan Goyer, Julie Miller, Rhys Inman, and many others, it can illuminate and contextualize the discoveries of science within a larger range of human experiences that are less accessible to the scientific method. Together, art and science can provide a means to unify the diversity of interpretations about human origins that evolved through the various religious traditions around the world, thereby contributing to the collective memory of the universe. Evolution on Earth has generated a vastly complex system of interconnected organisms and ecosystems, with the emergence of novel biophysical features enabling novel types of interaction and evolutionary modalities. Perhaps most remarkably, through the elaboration of culture, evolution has yielded an organism capable of conceiving of its own origins. Equally remarkable, this creature has developed the capacity to threaten its own existence through the clash of civilizations and war. It is perhaps ironic that the same cultural system, science, is responsible for the most advanced developments in each of these fields: evolutionary theory and the atomic bomb. The modernist culture that spawned each of these phenomena is also the source of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which envisions a peaceful world through cooperation and restraint. As many of the conflicts that ripple through the modern world are the product of centuries of clash between civilizations with different political and religious cultures, an understanding of the processes that generated these cultures is necessary before there is any hope of any lasting peace. The dogmatism and disagreements of competing religions can be seen as an inevitable byproduct of the structure by which they evolved, just as the gradual groping of science towards ever more accurate descriptions of natural phenomena is a direct consequence of its own structure. This essay has been limited to a comparison of religion, science, and art, but a similar analysis would illuminate our understanding of the evolution of other political and social organizations. Perhaps by understanding how evolutionary processes are themselves affected by the social ecology that shapes the networks through which culture evolves, we can learn to channel our evolution towards more humane solutions to the problems of existence. And I'll just add to that, to kind of follow up on what we were talking about in the last talk. I think that I was talking here mostly about science, religion, and art, but I think that any kind of social network can be thought of in these terms, and the way that social networks and the way that we communicate really does affect the way that ideas spread through networks. And I think that I kind of bring that back to the architecture of, say, the nervous system that we're envisioning for spaceship Earth. We might want to imagine how the architecture of this nervous system will constrain the ideas that evolve through it. So, thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I want to invite Jeff Foss, right? I believe so. To provide us with the kickoff to this particular thing. So just again to remind you, we're going to try and keep observations short in the interests of dialogue. If you could preface your question with an observation, do get to the question. If you don't have a question, then keep your observation to the minimum, a couple minutes. That goes not just for you, of course, but for everybody. Please.
Yeah, the idea of cultural evolution has a lot of cachet right now, and I very much am intrigued with the idea, and of course Dawkins has made it very popular, but it's interesting when you talk about sciences in terms of evolution, because those philosophers of science who've talked about science as an evolutionary process say it's not, if you accept this view, then you have to accept that evolution is not headed anywhere. Biological evolution is not aiming at, as it were, a dragon, a perfect form of life that lives forever and wraps its tail around the world and has fire in its belly or something. You can't get that. There's no ideal form of life. And the scientists who accept the view that science is evolutionary often will then go on to say, well, we evolve away from the problems we have. If the antelope is too slow, its muscles get a little bit bigger. It's not progressing towards an infinitely fast antelope or an antelope that will never be caught by predators. It is simply progressing away from the kind of limitation that it meets currently, but it's not really headed anywhere. Is that view of science?
Well, I think that's an accurate view of biological evolution. I think cultural evolution, just because it's based on consciousness, which has the capacity to envision and imagine things, it takes on directionality in a way that biological evolution doesn't.
So it's more teleological than biological evolution.
Well, as soon as you invoke consciousness, I think teleology is fait accompli. It's part of it. I mean, consciousness is by its nature.
We got a definition of what that is for those who don't.
Teleology, something that aims at a goal. I mean, there are natural examples. Your kidneys expel waste from your body, so the design of the kidney. The heart has a function, wings have function, so they're teleological. But
I don't think anybody would say that consciousness isn't teleological. I mean, at least I feel like my consciousness is goal-directed.
I mean, we set goals. I mean, so
Well, I don't think that I definitely don't have a problem with that. I think that evolution is goal-directed when it comes to culture.
So that's a big difference
Between science and between biological
and cultural evolution. Yeah.
Including creating the word.
Let's not just humble guys, because some people
Sorry,
really
I'm sorry.
I just want to note that can be and is debated. That culture is evolutionary.
Let's.
It's a debate.
You can't say, you have to now give us a short bite of what that means, because everything will be debated.
Cultures change. Cultures adapt to their situation, just like species do.
So you're suggesting that the culture has a sort of homeostasis, and
The idea of culture as self-determining is a new idea.
Of culture, what, sorry?
Of culture as self-determining, that we can direct the development of our culture.
I think here it's also a part of defining what culture is. So I'm not, when I say culture in this sense, I'm talking about ideas and not Christianity. Like I'm saying more that a whole bunch of ideas come together and form cohesive things, like kind of in the same way that a whole bunch of genes come together and form a frog. A whole bunch of cultural ideas come together and form.
Culture's a little slippery,
It's much more.
It's a little ambiguous.
It's much more fuzzy than a frog.
Yeah.
But it's.
The dominant meaning of culture is culture is the set of values, meanings, language, symbolic institutions of a particular society. Different societies have different cultures. You're referring to specific cultural institutions like religion, science, and art.
But he's also referring to specific units of culture.
Yeah, that's right. Now, whether an institution, a cultural institution, is somehow can be consciously directed is a different issue from the issue of whether a culture can be.
Yeah, and that's a much more complex problem than anything I've talked about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's trying to reach the basic unit of what might otherwise be similar to a gene. And I think that it's very brave to deal with it.
Yeah, meme is
Yeah, I think
I
it's
think
very
it's
brave. I think
also
it's very
a-
brave and very difficult to deal
a
with.
useful idea.
Yeah.
And at this moment in this culture, perhaps it can be directed.
Mhm. Yes, thank you.
But I wanted to just see if Jeff thoughts that we have it, to continue on with your.
But just, there are a lot of things I might say. I'm gonna talk about two things and tie them together. Maybe get them both out that way. I mean, if indeed cultural evolution is stronger than biological evolution, Dawkins has made a fundamental mistake about the priest, because the priest may, as it were, be planting memes. And as a university professor, I may have far more influence over the world through my memes than I would ever have through my genes, right? So I have ideas as my children, right, or students as my children. So it may be actually far more powerful than, as it were, going out and breeding like crazy. The other thing is that the funny thing about evolution, particularly as described by you, is it's very short term. The Irish elk mated on the basis, like many large animals, of antler size. I mean, antler size is a signal to females that you're a very healthy brood, right? I mean, it takes a lot of extra energy to generate these antlers every year. So the Irish elk were picked up on. The girls, I thought that was really cute. Look at the size of his antlers, my God. So they all mated with these, and their kids, of course, like the elk with the bigger antlers, but that turned out to be a dead end, didn't it? I mean, the Irish elk became extinct, it is thought, because their antlers got too doggone big for them to escape, probably from early Irishmen, right? who wanted to chase them through the woods, you know.
Wanted to mount them on their dead elks.
So what looks like a really good strategy early on, and is increasing your fitness, may lead to disaster later on. Now, we have a cultural analog, and it may even be science, and that is, we may discover truths that are far too dangerous for us to handle. I mean, if we could, as it were, any of us could make an explosive device out of household materials or something, God knows what.
I don't think the nuclear bomb's good for anybody. I don't think the nuclear bomb's been particularly good for anybody.
I don't know. At least it's hard to make, and it takes a lot of experts. But
Do you remember to speak up? Since we are recording it, we do want the transcribers.
So the question would be, if indeed you see culture as being evolutionary, do you fear? Do you have any sense that what looks like an immediate advantage may in the end turn out, as it has happened in the case of evolution, to be?
Well, yeah, I don't think that's controversial at all.
Yeah. So all the more.
I mean, I think that any biologist, especially, is very sensitive to the fact that fitness is a very fluid concept, and that a trait that's good in one environment may be crap in another environment, and that's central to one of the biggest misunderstandings about evolution, is that there's no fixed concept of what a most fit thing is. There's never one thing that's always going to be the most fit for every single context, and so I don't think that's at all controversial.
Yeah, I think that brings us, of course, to the foresight, right? I mean, one thing that the genes aren't doing is trying to plan ahead. They don't know whether they're going to get hit by a comet or a new disease, or they're reacting to the past. It's fundamentally reactive. In fact, you say that at one point. Yeah. So I think it's really important for us on the level of cultural evolution to start forward planning, as it were, to always try to think, where is this going to take us, whether it's the internet or...
One question respond to that. It's not a question, really. It's you made the response to that I want to make. In a way, it is built in, because degree of variation is important for adaptability of a species, for change. If there is a low degree of variation as a species characteristic, that species has less chance of adapting to a changed environment. So, you know, some species will be more adaptable than others depending on how much variation there is in, you know, how susceptible they are to mutation, or how important individualism is in your example.
I like, am I too?
Did you have your hand up? I couldn't see you.
Oh, I was just listening, but I do have a question.
Sure.
The problem that I have in this part of the essay is I feel that the way that you've managed religion is that you've worked backwards as a kind of polarity to what your main premise is on the fitness of how a meme might survive, and that what you describe is like working it back from an opposite point of view. In other words, you talk about how it requires the authority of the initial thing and then the faithful reproduction of those things. Those things I don't ever believe happen. There's 13 Gospels, or however many they are, and each one has a different statement and was done in a different time. So there really is no faithful representation, that almost automatically from the get-go, especially in the combination of the time between the written and the oral traditions of what happened in there. So when I read this originally, I thought, and as a matter of fact, when we were writing up the insights, the thought on this was to find a much more logical and much more genetic-based transitional thing, and that was looking at tribalism. Looking at tribalism as the interim aspect of this particular thing, so that you end up with a tribe that passes down its own mythology. And that tribe, it's never accurate. It's just simply set there, so that religion becomes the metaphor for that tribalism. But what you can do with the tribalism, and I would love to see it done, is set it back to, if you assume that you would die for your brother, and your brother would die for your cousin, at what level does that become competitive, where you are now in competition with your cousin, 5th removed or 6th removed? Now this becomes really important, because in the case of agriculture and in the case of tying people together in tribalism that way, there has to be some distance, some hypothetical distance of which your genes are reproducing very much in your favor. And this is a product of meiosis, so you're never going to get past this. This is, if meiosis itself has a value, then it's going to continue to happen this way, where you automatically are creating those variations once you get meiosis. So the question is or what you can do under that set of conditions is set up that model of which then you then enter into metaphorical tribalism. And then once you do that, that's what's binding those people together, is the metaphor and the meme spread from that particular point. And that's what's missing here, in my opinion, is that religion, in fact, is a metaphorical tribalism. It has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with the perpetuation of the tribe, and at the agricultural level, the perpetuation of a community and its justification for all of the things it's going to do in relation to invasion and slavery and everything else. And now it becomes a justification under that. But it does begin from that very first premise of, I will die for my brother, I will die for my cousin, I will not die for my 4th cousin.
Yeah. So there's two things there. I didn't mean to say that religions are accurate. I meant to say that they attempt to be accurate in following, in handing down the traditions. And I don't think that actually in practice happens very faithfully. I fully see what you mean. The second thing, you've really independently arrived at Hamilton's rule, which states that as long as the benefit that your ancestor, that your kin receive exceeds the cost that you suffer by a factor equal to the relatedness, your genetic relatedness. So that's 1/2 for your brothers, and 1/4 for your half brothers, and 1/8 for your cousins, and so on as you get further and further related. As long as that inequality works, then cooperative behaviors will be, your altruistic, like sacrificing your own fitness will be favored. And so that's
Do you accept that? Do you accept that?
Well, that's
Okay,
a canon.
yeah, so
Can you bring that up on the screen when we're done over the break?
Do what?
Can you bring that up on the screen in the break?
On the screen? Yeah, we'll type it up. Sure.
Just on the break, so that people can.
So the application that I'm looking for there, or I'd love to see there, is the application of that concept, once you move it to that point, where tribalism itself, because what happened is, as far as I can see, that tribalism carried on in hunting and gathering only up to a certain level, and that was it. So carrying it on in an agricultural setting actually expanded the tribal concept of it and bound people by the meme pool rather than the genetic reality of those things, and bound people metaphorically to each other at that particular level. Now, it's just, you just have to arrive at a hypothetical level. But what you can't do is ever assume that any of that will ever be faithfully transmitted, because it will only be transmitted on the basis of the interest, the volatile interest of the tribalism.
I definitely agree with that. I think that one component from the individual's perspective within that context, though, is that they do want to believe that they have the truth.
Yes.
And so they do want to believe that they're accurately transmitting the faithful representation.
Yes.
And so that, I think that that's more what I was trying to communicate.
Yes, I know. But really what you need is a model that shows the falsity of the test, I think, from the very outset of it. Because, as I said earlier, if you deal with the things that you can't know, then you deal with this kind of voodoo aspect of reality that anyone who's ever got the loudest mouth or whatever is going to create that thing of truth when in those areas that you can't know. These are areas that you could possibly know, at least in a hypothesis. And it's probably testable in a hypothesis as well. Whereas the can't know things, which are the parts of a religion, fall into that particular category, and then you're just lost after that. But I think under that multiple that we're talking about, you actually could multiply it out. You actually could arrive at a hypothetical meme state where this thing will perpetuate. Does that make sense? Whereas the other way, I felt like you were working backwards to it. That you already created a polarity from science, and now you're working back as to what religion is. Whereas it was the transitory, the transition.
Getting at any kind of group dynamics, which I think is just another layer of complexity, and just to try and keep things a little bit simple.
But you can if you use that hypothesis. At some point or another, memes will kick in and bind people who otherwise have no self-interest whatsoever, or even genetic interest.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's also certainly in most evolution happens at the individual level, but I think there's certainly an argument for group selection in human history, and so just selection for large groups and groups that were bigger and more cohesive were able to trash the groups that were smaller, and I think just that. Whether or not there was genetic relatedness or not is an argument for cohesiveness and for tribalism on itself. And so just a basic group selection, group size, I think that's sufficient to even get to that point.
And that'll get your roots of religion.
Yeah, you can have that without relatedness. So
I'm going to go to observers and then back to Brian next. So Vaughn, go ahead. I remember to speak up, and can you get the light up there?
Yeah, I have this curiosity about prehistoric art and how they discovered in 1996, they discovered some caves in France that dated back even 16,000 years earlier than the Lascaux caves. So that here were these artists that were making paintings that were incredibly beautiful, and they maintained a consistent discipline for 30,000 years in their culture. And these were hunter-gatherers, but just wondering they must have villages, or they must have been stable areas where these folks existed in order to create these caves and places they went to. And so the art was in a way kind of a religious thing as well as just an art thing, and it related to their whole way of being. So how does that fit into this concept? group of people that can exist that long and be so consistent. I mean, you need a time machine to really know how it all worked.
So the question is, to no one specifically, but if anybody wants to take that one on,
I can
sure.
What he's talking about is the ability to pass a meme along, which is a framework. So if you look at it, you're talking about the Chauvet Cave. It's 200 miles from Florence. And if you look at it, you'll find the same line in the Chauvet Cave in Michelangelo and in Leonardo.
Yeah.
So that was passed from generation to generation to generation. That's what we're talking about, is
Yeah.
those parts of a meme, that part of something that can pass along consistently over and over and over and over through a generation. So that's the thing that we're looking for. That is that basic unit that will pass from generation to generation to generation. And it's amazing because those lines are their lines, and that line is like 200 miles away. So you can just see that for 30,000 years, artists in that part of the world were passing along a concept of viewing reality. Those are the units we're looking at. We're trying to get some subset, just a hypothetical subset of memes that would allow that to be passed along and held. So that's the value of this particular conversation.
Did that answer your question, or thought a little bit more clearly? Or is
I'm just curious, is that a genetic thing, or is it just something that's there?
Well, you just imagine that it's taught from one painter
Is
to
it
the
taught
next.
from one
Yeah.
person to another, or is it just a natural?
Well, it could, I mean, in this case, how I'm talking about culture is just that it is taught, and if it is taught, then it takes on an evolutionary life of its own, and there's a lineage. I mean, the one painter teaches the next painter teaches the next painter, and to the extent that they teach with fidelity, then it passes on the same way. And to the extent that a painter experiments and decides to try a new line, then novelty is generated, and then
So, and that line has a fluidity to it, it just maintains itself.
well, yeah, I mean, as long as they continue to pass it on to the next generation of painters. Yeah.
Okay, we have Jenny.
I wanted to say, well,
Oh, so actually, no, it's Ryan. Were you first?
yeah.
Yeah, apologize.
No, that's okay. In reference to what you were saying, it's basically a population in isolation. The reason that an artist 200 miles away and 35,000 years later is in the same line is because of a small lineage from one to the next, I think. But I wanted to bring what you're talking about. I was struck by the models of communication that you had shown. Sort of the priestly model down the line with this circle around it, and this scientific model in which things come back in, and the model of information dissemination where it can't get from this point to that point on the outside circle at the edge. And I want to bring it back to your discussion, which was essentially how do we create a humanity-based nervous system, a web of information, so to speak, and what Jenny was saying about information theory. It strikes me that we've reached a point very recently in history in which information can go around the outside edge of the circle exceedingly easily, and there's no more center.
The internet is a
Yeah,
classic.
absolutely.
And the internet is really unique in its ways that it's more, and this is a chunk that I cut out of the, maybe I shouldn't have cut out of the talk. But
Sam, you gotta speak up.
the internet's very democratic in the way that you can have individuals elect to become a central node just by their popularity. And if their website gets hit a whole bunch of times, then it rises to the top of Google's search engine, and other people find it more often. And that kind of process of an individual with no, this is especially for the spread of art, but for other things as well. Pretty much anything that's communicated through the internet has the potential to individuals that don't have a lot of access to. I mean, traditionally television, you can only control the factors of communication through television if you had lots of money and you knew the people that owned the television network. Whereas the internet is democratic, and it's a kind of medium that facilitates one-to-many transmission from lots of different people.
But it strikes me that we no longer even have nodes anymore.
What's
or
that?
We don't even have significant nodes anymore. The nodes that we have,
Well, every individual is a node.
every individual is a node, which means that they're all equally insignificant at some level. There's too many nodes. So now the information that's being passed around is devolving into meaninglessness because there's no particular.
That's what his paper says.
Yeah.
To some extent.
Yeah.
But I mean, then you have things like, and just that becomes an argument of how well Google works. I mean, if Google prioritizes things that are good, then it actually does work. If Google just prioritizes whatever old thing, then it really wouldn't work very well. Or anything. I mean, any of those kinds of things like YouTube, which also works the same kind of way. You know, the number of hits that a video gets influences how many other people see it. We get in a long discussion about how that actually affects the spread of things, but
Jenny, Jerry, Jeff.
Just a really quick question about what you were saying about cave paintings. Aren't remarkably similar paintings found on several continents at this sort of in the same range of human development?
I'm not sure about that. I don't actually know anything about the cave paintings, but I think that it's tempting to say that there's an evolutionary lineage connecting one painting to a modern painter, and perhaps that is the case with Leonardo, but it's also very possible that you can just have something like an evolution, people often call this convergent evolution, where independent evolutionary lineages happen on the same technologies or the same biological innovations just by chance because there's constraint, because there's only certain ways that you can solve a problem. So you see wings evolving over and over again, and you see eyes evolving. Eyes have evolved 63 times in different lineages, at least at last count. And so certain things like for detecting light, well, an eye is a good way of doing that, or for trying to understand your environment, an eye is a good way to do that. And maybe for trying to represent a human, well, a certain kind of line is a good way to do that. And so maybe people actually happened upon this independently in lots of different places. And so the finding of the same kind of trait in lots of different places, something that looks exactly the same, doesn't necessarily mean that they share an evolutionary history and that they can all be traced back to a common ancestor. But it might mean that. There could be independent evolution just by chance, or that's a good way to do things and that people happened upon that. Or it could be that they actually do share a common ancestor. And that's often a really fruitful thing to think about in evolution. People in biology look at those questions all the time.
Do you want me to follow up, or are you?
Sam's remarks very close to mine. The question of the Lascaux line. It is a question: is it genetic, or is it memetic, or is it some combination of the two? How it would be a combination of the two? There are a variety of possibilities. One is that we've got a genetic predisposition to respond in certain ways, and so we respond in those ways, and that way has got a high genetic probability anyway, and so it gets transmitted easily. Or another way it could be a mix is this way: it's an adaptation by genetically similar organism, human on this continent, human on that continent, to a similar environmental exigency, similar environmental constraint. You know, we're all humans. We've all got 2 arms and 2 legs.
Wait, though.
Yes.
There's an assumption that it happened on other continents. I don't know that it has. Which ones?
South America, Africa.
Oh, but those were the lines are quite different, aesthetically very different.
That's
And
fine.
that's part of the thing is that I find the aesthetics very, very different from continent to continent.
Well, let's not talk about this specific.
Well,
We're going on a presupposition that exists. So
But it might exist in other cultural means other than ours.
Even if not, it could be the same consideration could be broadened to if it happened on more continents. We just talk about it that one continent. That the same line could have been invented over and over and over and over again, because the world stayed pretty much the same, and the people who kept inventing it were genetically similar enough so that they kept inventing the same line over and over and over again. In a way, that's kind of part of what I'm going to say about the human soul. That the human soul is this genetic potential for experiencing in the kind of environment that humans live in, and so we keep making similar maps. The artist goes to to this place that is and you can keep it. So and if you bring it back and you show it to someone else who has been there, but they recognize it because we're, in a way, we're there anyway. So, this universal humane similarity is based on our genetics and our similar environments.
Great observation, actually. Did you need to?
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the most striking similarities between the European and the South American paintings is the handprint that's made with, placing the hand on the rock and then blowing the pigment so that it's sort of a negative print. That's found at least on 2 continents.
Interesting.
Australia.
Sorry?
Australia as well.
Australia.
Oh.
Well, maybe it's too far to think that there's some, I've read about this morphogenetic field of energy, that information actually transfers through the ether.
Like Jerry will deal with his.
Rupert Sheldrake is the guy I was.
I like that as a metaphor, but not as a literal truth.
Well, it's something you can really prove.
Right.
Although they've experimented with it, and there's some facts, with animal behavior.
I'm going to cut this conversation up. It's somewhat tangential to Sam's main point, and
Really?
yeah.
You said that the internet has democratized the control of communications in a way that no other previous technology was able. I think that's true. It just seems to me that, and I'm not sure, it seems to me everyone's assuming that this is an essential aspect of the internet, and it strikes me as it's just an accidental aspect of the internet, and that the postmodern revolution will involve people taking control of the internet. I mean, there are people already controlling internet access in some countries. There's nothing to prevent people from controlling the internet, perhaps in ways we're not even aware of. We may assume that it's.
I think that's a really good argument for these free access movements right now. Is that, it's not guaranteed that the internet will maintain that structure and that flexibility to it at all.
Yeah. The telecoms just tried to prioritize access, which would have resulted in control of that sort.
But the architecture itself, even at those high speeds, the high speed nodes. Quite frankly, the internet is a real physical thing. It's not just some etherical thing. So there are big cables, and they are laid down, and it really is real. So there's real money, and there's real nodes and business, and it's really there. So it's the illusion that we have because it's freely accessible. If you go to China, there's lots of websites that pop up with this cute little Chinese thing that basically is a cute little Chinese censor not letting you go there. So it's quite simple to block it off. And the architecture that I'm interested in exploring is how you actually think this is either useful or not useful, because you suggest that we have a many to many or many instances of a one to many. So basically, peer to peer was the example you used. And Brian Nix was saying, well, doesn't that just promote mediocrity? Because in your argument, or basically anything irrelevant of it, whether it's fit or not, or whether it serves any purpose or not, can spread equally well. So if the only arbiter is popularity, a la Google, what does that mean for us in terms of being able to filter through it and assess the quality?
I think that's the success of some things like, say, Wikipedia, is that it's become an institution that now has kind of a natural selection to it. People update single entries, and the access to Wikipedia, anybody can put something on there that will be viewed by lots of people, but then anybody can also revise it. And so any given entry in Wikipedia goes through a process that's kind of like natural selection on culture. And so, these kinds of institutions, I think, are really successful institutions that mix the best of the internet with the best of more formal, consistent one-to-many architectures like science, where there's actual people charged with kind of consistently passing on the canon of science. I think that's a really good question, is actually envisioning. I think that I haven't even cracked the surface of what matters about this. And so I think that there's a lot to think about with that.
Very interesting. Do any observers have any further questions for us at this point?
Just a comment. that the internet is not nearly as democratic as we might think it is in some ways. Like, originally, I guess when Google started off, the search engines prioritized things based on popularity and who was looking at what and tracking trends, but it's become a little bit more sinister since then, and it's quite easy to manipulate it. So, I mean, I think maybe that period of, you know, the enlightened age of the internet might already be.
The enlightened minute of the internet?
The enlightened age of the free and open internet is sort of, it's been squared in to some degree.
Okay, are there any last comments? We're going to wrap